Yes, now it's time to reflect on the last 2 days because we had so many interesting panels and forum discussions that we are going to look at the key takeaways we have. But before we start with our panel, we have a special message from Paul van Tigchelt, the Minister of Justice of the Belgian presidency. So let's have a view at this message.
Dear guests, colleagues and human rights experts, on behalf of Belgium, that is currently holding the EU presidency, I would like to express my gratitude to the Fundamental Rights Agency for organizing this crucial forum. Europe is confronted with complex human rights challenges. Dialogue and collaboration are of enormous importance. Unfortunately, I am unable to be with you in person today. Therefore, I am addressing you through this video message. The digital revolution, societal polarization, and climate change undoubtedly pose significant threats to our fundamental rights. These challenges transcend national borders, demanding a unified European response. We must stand united to take on our responsibility in this regard. Let me start with the digital revolution. Being the Belgian Justice Minister, I would like to illustrate this through the lens of the Belgian justice system. For numerous years, we lagged behind in digitalization. Now, with the support of European funds, we are catching up significantly. The modernization of the justice system not only enhances efficiency, but also democratizes access to justice, making the legal process faster, more transparent, and more accessible for all citizens. However, a significant portion of our population lacks digital skills, and some do not even have access to the internet. We must ensure that digitalization does not undermine their rights. We must offer enough offline alternatives and meanwhile close the digital divide. Digitalization also leads us to the topic of protecting democracy and civil space. While artificial intelligence holds immense potential, it can also be misused to manipulate information, sow discord, and erode trust in our institutions. We must remain vigilant against these emerging threats. In this regard, I am pleased to note the successful approval of the Council conclusions on the application of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights on the 5th of March by the Justice Council. It specifically addresses effective legal protection and access to justice through the promotion of trust. I would also like to stress the important role that national human rights institutes, equality bodies, and ombuds services play in this regard. Also, shaping a socially and environmentally sustainable Europe remains a top priority. The geopolitical reality and extreme weather events prove the urgency of accelerating the transition to a climate-neutral and self-sufficient energy model. However, this transition must go hand in hand with affordable energy and workable regulations for all. The recent farmer protests in Brussels highlight the complex social and economic considerations involved in this transition. The insightful discussions held at this forum will undoubtedly provide valuable food for thought in dealing with these complex challenges. Our union was built upon human rights. Human rights are what hold us together. We must stand united to safeguard them. We will not let our countries be driven apart. On behalf of the Belgian presidency, I thank all of you taking on this vital responsibility when it comes to the protection, the enhancement, and the promotion of fundamental rights in our union and member states. Together, we can build a stronger, more just, and more sustainable future for Europe and beyond. Thank you and good luck.
Round of applause, please, for Paul van Tigchelt, the Belgian Justice Minister. Well, let's now start with our panel, and I would like to welcome our panelists. First, we have Alexandria Walden. the Global Head of Human Rights. Please feel free to take a seat at Google. She is the leading company's initiatives in line with the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And next we have Michael O'Flaherty, incoming Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights, previously Director of the Fundamental Rights Agency. Welcome to you as well. And joining us, Commissioner Dunja Mijatović, Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights with extensive experience in media freedom and human rights advocacy. And last but not least, we have Nils Muižnieks, Europe Regional Director at Amnesty International, former Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights and a leader in civil society and human rights advocacy. Welcome to this panel. Well, it's time to reflect. Maybe we can start with you, Commissioner Mijatović. How do you view the overall impact of the forum discussions on shaping the future of democracy and also civic space in Europe?
So, hi, can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, it's already muted.
Very grateful and very happy to be here. I finally made it because I could not do it during my tenure. And I was always present online. So I'm really glad that I'm here in Vienna and also able to experience this unbelievable energy that comes from the audience, which is actually giving us the right, not only direction, but also a reason to believe that we still have to continue our struggle for human rights for all. The three wonderful rapporteurs already stated most of the things that were picked up from the discussions. But what we are also all aware is that this is nothing new. We have the tools, we have mechanisms, we have this extraordinary important agency for fundamental rights. We have Council of Europe, the UN, the OSCE. We have agencies, mandates. Everything has been established over the years, decades, in order to ensure that people can really reach out to their rights. Why are we still struggling is the question I would like to ask, even though everything, as I already stated, has been said in the past 2 days. Many messages picked up in order to see where and in which direction shall we go. But what the second rapporteur was talking about and what was mentioned is something that I think, also based on a discussion here, but also something that I experienced in the past 6 years during my tenure. And it was really started by Nils and also our predecessor Thomas and Alvaro at the Council of Europe, talking about the rule of law, which is a key in not only exercising human rights, but also making sure that if there are wrongdoings, we can reach certain justice, or at least partial justice. And what I've seen lately by Council of Europe member states, and here I'm also talking about 27 EU member states, is that somehow this rule of law, I would say mankind's greatest achievements, is somehow neglected in a very brutal and not even sophisticated way. It is related to the implementation of the judgments of the national courts. It is related to the attacks on judiciary, on the judges, the way the judges are appointed. And this is not really only happening in Europe. It is also across the ocean, and I'm sure Alexandra will mention some of those issues that are affecting our digital world. And this is something that I also communicated to participating states at the OSCE during my tenure here, but also during these 6 years at the Council of Europe. If we come in this situation where democracies are doing exactly the same as the ones that we are trying to teach or to make them believe why it is important to believe and to exercise everything that is related to the rule of law, we will fail. And we will also fail if we do not manage, as the international community, to live in the society where we reach out to the young generation. If we do not manage to win hearts and minds of the young generation. And in this process, I would say, without going into details and also letting my fellow panelists have their say, I would say the rule of law is something that really stayed as a main issue that creates all other problems underneath, above, and very much interrelated and intertwined situation that affects all our rights. And not to mention the situation with the war in Ukraine, brutal aggression. It is again that we are aiming and awaiting the rule of law to fix at least some justice when it comes to the accountability and war crimes.
And if we already have the tools and mechanisms, what is missing and what was also maybe missing during the panel talks, Michael O'Flaherty, what would you say?
What was missing? Before I get to that, what there was. But even before that, I want to congratulate the agency for pulling off an amazing forum. And I want to welcome Sirpa to the job and assure her of all my support, and also reassure her of something she's already found out, which is that she's surrounded by a wonderful team at the Fundamental Rights Agency. Now, let's start with what's been achieved. I was struck by remarkable things at the forum. The first is, and it's very much exemplified by the table reports we heard just now, that it seems there's been a passing of the baton. There's a new generation of human rights activism, and it's different. It's different. It's optimistic. It's smart. It's energetic. It's deeply principled, and it's young. And we have to accept that and rejoice in it and gain our hope from it. And I think the energy that's been on show here for 2 days is capable of making a real difference for human well-being. The second thing that I think has been achieved in this forum is that it has come of age. The ideas of bringing people together, as Friso would say, all the unusual suspects, throwing them into the room together. The idea of hardwiring a youth voice into the discussions, they're not new. They've been there in all the fora. But I got a sense that it happened naturally in this gathering over these 2 days. It didn't have to be struggled for. There was a recognition that there was a lovely term, mixed methodologies, I think was the term. The idea that we need mixed methodologies to fix problems, it just came so naturally and obviously. And so I think that's very impressive. What's missing? Look, there's always going to be something missing because hard choices had to be made. But I would like to have had more discussion about Ukraine. The Russian aggression against Ukraine is not just it is against the Ukrainian people. It's against the abducted children, but it's against everybody. It's about everybody who stands up for values on this planet. Again, it's a matter of huge urgency that needs close attention. So that's something where I would have liked to see more attention. I was also surprised, maybe I just I was in the wrong rooms perhaps, but gender. And the extent to which we have to adopt gendered approaches to everything we do, it didn't come out so much, at least from the main stage. And perhaps that's something, looking to the next iteration of the forum, could be something for the agency to reflect on. But ultimately, very well done and a huge success.
Well, that's good to hear. So I guess that you also have some key takeaways, Mr. Muižnieks. So what would you say, in what ways can your takeaways guide your efforts to address the growing inequalities in Europe and also the challenges faced by vulnerable communities?
No, thank you. It's been a really stimulating, I wouldn't call it a forum, I think it's more of a jamboree where you have cultural events and activists, you have new media, you have people who are not the usual suspects who we usually talk to in the human rights world all come together. So I really salute the agency for convening such a diverse group of people. Addressing inequalities solely through a human rights perspective is very challenging because a human rights toolbox is not really set up to deal with the big systemic issues that are at the root of many of these inequalities. Our system is very individualistic. So in other words, we're not very good at dealing with systemic racism and the consequences of systemic racism, both in Europe and beyond it. We look at individual violations. Our human rights system's not very good at dealing with systemic rule of law issues that Dunja highlighted, because you can begin to undermine the independence of the judiciary without immediate individual human rights violations. Those come later on. The same thing globally, to address the systemic issues at the cause of some of the global inequalities is very difficult through this human rights prism. That said, I think the rapporteurs did a great job in summarizing these discussions, some of which I just want to note couldn't have happened very recently. When I was Commissioner for Human Rights 6 years ago, we have barely touched on climate issues. We barely touched on climate issues at all, and now they're at the center of the discussion here, which is really great to see. What struck me a bit was that climate protests and climate protesters were not at the center of the discussions here. And they are the ones who are most targeted, among the most targeted by authorities in Europe, through smear campaigns, through really harsh prosecutions, through, in some places, being investigated for founding criminal organizations. In some places, they're banned from invoking the climate emergency in court cases. So I missed the climate protesters and the pressures that they're under a bit here. The other thing I missed a bit, I mean, the other group of protesters I think who are really under pressure are those who are protesting in solidarity with Palestinian human rights. I think it's I think there's no other issue that has faced kind of preemptive blanket bans on protests in Europe other than pro-Palestinian human rights protests. In a number of countries, in Germany, in Austria, Poland, Hungary, you name it. On no other issue have we seen preemptive bans on protests where you're not even allowed to go out and express your point of view. And I find that quite striking and a bit scary. And Amnesty, which I represent now, is a decentralized movement that really wants to mobilize people. And there are some great ideas here about what are the necessary prerequisites for mobilizing people. And a lot of it comes back to human rights education broadly understood. Everybody was talking about literacy, algorithmic literacy, digital literacy, human rights literacy, information literacy. And in the end, it all comes down to human rights education. If you're not aware about your rights and the mechanisms, if you cannot think in those terms, it's very difficult to mobilize. You won't see the opportunities, but also the importance of culture, messages of hope, to give people the idea that their mobilization matters and it can make a difference. And that was very heartening to see a lot of this focus on communication. How do we get people aware of their rights, willing to exercise them, and to have hope that they can actually achieve something? So I gained a lot from this, but I think I thought it was interesting also what was not highlighted in this discussion.
Yeah, so the three of you have already mentioned a few of the current topics which show how important it is to take care of our fundamental rights. From your perspective as Global Head of Human Rights at Google, Alexandria Walden, what would you say, how do you see the role of technology in promoting human rights in Europe?
Sure. Well, and I'd just love to sort of reflect on what I've heard over the course of the 2 days too, because I think, because I lead human rights at a tech company, I spend a lot of time talking to stakeholders about their concerns, about the challenges of tech, about potential harms of tech, and what we can do to mitigate those harms. And all of that is important, and I expected that to happen here. What was sort of unexpected for me was to hear the undercurrent of optimism that actually we can work together to realize the benefits of technology, and that, just to reinforce, it does require all of the stakeholders at the table to do that. And the sort of creativity, hearing from the cultural strategist or the speaker who was designing anti-facial recognition clothing, it's very interesting to hear from folks who are being creative and optimistic about how we address these challenges. From tech company, and I also feel privileged to be here. I think this is one of the things that, what can tech companies do? I feel privileged to be here from Google. I know there's one or two other companies, but because digitization and tech at the intersection of human rights is going to continue to be an important part of this conversation for all of us, more companies need to be engaging in this fora and a variety of others with civil society stakeholders around these challenges and opportunities. Big companies, small companies, companies across the tech stack, all of those folks need to kind of be both hearing from you and getting your feedback and expertise and guidance about how to address these challenges. And just to kind of pick up on one of the things that the tables talked about importantly is about, talking about the proliferation of frameworks. Fundamentally, I think companies have to be committed to the UN guiding principles, and that has to inform how we think about how we comply with all of the regulations. And then also there's a burden on the states, on governments, to ensure that they are creating regulatory coherence for us, especially multinational companies that are operating across jurisdictions, and that sort of comes back to the rule of law issues. When we're operating countries with weak rule of law, whether they're Western democracies or not, that creates barriers to companies protecting the rights of our users. And so it does require a multi-stakeholder engagement to ensure that governments and companies are having the best interests of all of the communities that are using our products.
So, Commissioner Mijatović, what concrete steps can be taken to ensure that the outcomes and also recommendations of the forum discussions can be implemented on policy and be taken into action?
Well, the implementation in general of the recommendations, implementation of the court judgments, everything that is related to compliance with the rules that member states in general of any organization voluntarily agreed upon is really their responsibility. We cannot shift away the focus and look at different other entities and not actually the states that are responsible for the implementation as an excuse to find another tools to make them really do their job. Sometimes I think we are too soft or not very direct in addressing these issues, because it is the responsibility of the elected officials, particularly in the democracies, to play by the rule and to play by the book. And if they don't do this, there are mechanisms and mandates that should be doing their part, which is assisting, helping, trying to really push them into implementation. But at the end, there is no special formula or a magic or a crystal ball that commissioners or any other institution that is dealing with human rights can fix this problem if there is no clear, genuine political will. So this is something that we all know. Politicians, governments created these institutions, and I think this is extraordinary, courageous, and people who actually played a role in establishing FRA, Council of Europe Commissioner's Office, UN High Commissioner's Office, had wisdom and courage to do so. If you ask me if it would be possible nowadays, I would say no. Mm-hmm. The big question is why, but that's almost philosophical, and I do not want us to get into this discussion. But that is one more reason to preserve and to really keep those institutions really live, but I would also add kicking. In a sense, to really point out when we see grave human rights violations. And unfortunately, this is what we see nowadays quite often. This, again, can also not solve the problem, but the visibility and exposing grave human rights violations, we mentioned Ukraine, we mentioned Middle East and what's happening in Gaza, but it's also Sudan, it's also many other places that we are somehow forgetting because media is not reporting or is simply outside of our comfort zone. So in order to do human rights and to work on recommendations, I think we all need to really get out of our comfort zone or a bubble, call it whatever, and also realize that us here in this room, in Rathaus, are not the reality. The reality is really getting to the places where there are human rights violations, where you really see people suffering. And I mean, three of us, I know, we've been to those places. We know what it means, just to listen to the testimonies. And just to look at people's eyes. You even do not have to hear anything. And then to realize how our jobs are responsible. And it can make a difference if you give a bit of hope, but hope only cannot solve the problem. So I think we can be better, we can do better in Europe in general. Michael always liked to be very positive. And I think it's absolutely crucial. We cannot do this job if we are not optimistic and if we fail, to give hope to people. And there is hope, and I again see, really hope in youth, in young people. But then again, if they look at us now and think, oh my God, shut up, we had enough. What is the action? How you are going to solve, jobs for us, how you are going to make sure that there is a change, that there is, the racism is not really popping out of every single box you open. Women are neglected. We are even in 21st century fighting for sexual and reproductive health and rights. LGBTI community, not to mention trans people, are used as a scapegoat, migrants. And all this you hear from televisions in Europe. And here I'm talking about EU. I would not even go outside the EU member states to see what are politicians and governments saying in this extremely important year for the future in order to win votes. It is embarrassing. And this is something that the young people should be really paying attention to when they go and vote. And we, working on human rights, we will continue raising it. But then again, it is the leaders that should show courage and really open their minds and hearts in order to ensure that the world of diversity and respect of human rights is something that we see in the future, and not boxes, and not walls, and not Fortress Europe.
So we are in a, yes. So we are, yeah.
If I could follow on from Dunja, she mentioned about my optimism, and I am hopeful, but we are also on the edge of a precipice, and I'm in complete agreement with Dunja on that. We're at the point when we could lose the everything that's been created since 1948, or whenever you want to start counting, could be lost. We're at the moment in history where it's not just about violating rights, it's about repudiating rights. And it's a very sensitive moment. The point was very well made yesterday by Emily O'Reilly when she spoke about the extent to which, in the interest of doing deals with extremes, principle gets sacrificed. And it's getting sacrificed all the time, and it doesn't have the clear red line of respect for the international human rights commitments and agreements. So I'm in complete agreement. And this year is crucial. This, as we've said repeatedly, this is the year of elections. It's about holding politicians to account. So we should be engaging with social movements and ourselves, demanding leadership, human rights, respectful leadership from the people we'll be voting for. I'm talking about the European elections. I'm talking about national elections. We're in a Rathaus. I'm talking about local elections as well. Still very overlooked, albeit we've spoken about cities, and that's very encouraging. And then the one other thing, and forgive me, and I'm largely repeating what Dunja said, but there's been a very strong thread across the three themes over the last 2 days, and that has the relationship to human rights problems with regard to each of them and inequality. inequality and democracy, inequality and tech, inequality and the environment. And so one of my takeaways to change my own work practice is a recognition I cannot avoid tackling inequality, I cannot avoid tackling poverty and exclusion as integral to every aspect of everything that I do working for human rights. And I'd very much encourage us all to ask ourselves, are we paying enough attention? If we work, take the private, if you're in Google, are you reflecting enough on inequality? If you're working in an NGO dealing with any issue, it's central to everything, and that has been very clear from our discussion over the last 2 days.
Yes, and you have mentioned the major election year, you have mentioned the Russian aggression against Ukraine, then Israel and Gaza. So we have deep fakes, we have political polarization. So how do we bridge the gap between human rights principles and the realities of policymaking? What would you say, Michael O'Flaherty?
Still me, okay. Well, we got a lot of the answers from the rapporteurs. Again, they spoke about smart messaging, about effectively communicating your claims and your demands. The Fundamental Rights Agency can teach a lot for that because it evidence-bases its claims. The reason it gets paid attention to in EU strategies is because it generates the empirical comparable data to show that this is the problem and this is how it's fixed. I think we can all do a better job of matching law with empiricism to justify what we're asking for. We can demand accountability. Somebody again is over here said it's about law. It's not about favors, it's not about good practice, being nice, it's about legal obligations. And legal obligations can be, individuals, societies and states can be held accountable. And there just isn't enough of that. I'm still appalled at the extent to which you can make a hate-filled speech as a European politician and get completely away with it. That's entirely unacceptable. And again, we have to be far more strident in our demands for justice.
And Mr. Muižnieks.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow on the topic of accountability. One issue which was not very prominent in discussions here, but which in my own humble opinion is one of the most toxic is migration and what's going on at the borders of Europe. Those of us who have been in this field for a while have seen a change where earlier, states would deny and hide the violations going on at the border. The pushbacks, the violent summary returns, the ill treatment. Now they proudly announce how many people they've pushed back at the border every week to show a population that they are doing something. This is a scary development, and we don't see it because we're not allowed very often to go to the borders. So you don't really know about the problem unless you can see it. Lighthouse has done some great work on this. Amnesty has tried to do some work on this. Commissioner's office has regularly drawn attention to this. But this is an issue that is invisible to most people because they don't care. The second is, and this is a very uncomfortable topic for the EU, is outsourcing of migration-controlled dirty work to third countries, like Morocco, like Libya, like Turkey, like Rwanda, and are these countries that we can trust to adhere to human rights in dealing with migrants and asylum seekers? I don't think so. And this is a very uncomfortable topic, which I think is really important. It's very difficult for the EU Fundamental Rights Agency to take this issue on, but I think it's for the rest of us, we have to take it on head on and say, listen, put your money where your mouth is when you're cooperating with third countries. You can't have one standard within the EU and another standard working with countries outside.
Yeah, so this is definitely food for thought, but because we have 4 minutes left, I would like to ask you as a closing remark to be as optimistic as Mr. O'Flaherty and think of if you had a magic wand, what would you wish for the future of humans in the EU? So who would like to start? Alexandria. The one thing you would wish for.
The one thing.
Yeah.
Well, I guess what I continue to wish for is for all stakeholder groups to work together to put at the center of all of our work human rights frameworks. And when we do that, that proliferates into doing better on migration, tech companies across the board doing better on rights. You name the issue, if you put a rights framework at the center, that is, I think, the best way to create progress and iterate in an ongoing way to see benefit.
Thank you. Michael O'Flaherty.
Yeah, I have one. We've mentioned so many groups, and I don't dispute anything. I associate myself with much that I've heard. But there's one other group not mentioned yet, the Roma. The day when a Roma community feels honoured and respected in our society will be the magic day. It's the great scandal of our era. Our children and future generations will look back with horror and say, how could you tolerate this exclusion, marginalization, victimization of an entire community, countless millions of people? And so standing up for and seeing real results for the human rights of our Roma brothers and sisters would be the magic moment for me.
Commissioner Mijatović.
So I would now be like, this Miss Universe replies, I wish peace, but I truly wish, peace for Ukraine and Ukrainian people, just peace. And I do not think we need to invent a wheel or, offer something, even if I would have a magic stick. If I think of our continent, Europe, and of course the EU, I would just go back to basic, what we already have, and ensure people's decent life in dignity. So all children can go to school, nobody's hungry, and all these things that are actually basic human rights issues, nothing that you would call luxurious sort of way of dealing with human rights. Going back to basic and ensuring that all those, I would say, not just rules, but obligations for a decent and dignified life are at the forefront of all political agendas that we are hearing now. If this is missing, and if this is neglected in the name of hate and hatred and division, then, this is not the future I wish for Europe or the world at all.
Thank you. And Nils Muižnieks.
Yeah, other than what do I wish for Europe? Other than a good outcome to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with Ukraine coming out on top, that's the most important thing. But I think that with regard to what I would like to see this year is not backsliding on the two issue areas which have been most volatile to change: women's rights and LGBTI rights. It's actually, these are the issue areas where actually there's been backsliding, but there's also some progress. It's quite interesting. For example, Finland, Spain, France on abortion rights. For example, Switzerland, Netherlands on consent-based rape laws. For example, Latvia, Istanbul Convention. LGBTI rights, trans rights, progress in Germany, Finland, Spain, Latvia, Greece. Who would have thought Greece? Same-sex marriage. That we can build on those progress, on these incidents of progress, and not see any backsliding, but only progress after all the elections that we have here. That's my hope, that we can take these small steps, build on them, and go forward. So it's not all dark, there is hope, and we have to move forward with small steps, but in the right direction.
That's a beautiful and optimistic closing remark. Thank you very much. Thanks again, Alexandria, Walden, Michael O'Flaherty, Commissioner Mijatović, and Nils Muižnieks. Thank you very much. And now,